everybody. Today we are in Unit 8, Day 4, and we are going to be talking about JFK and the LBJ administrations. The reason that we are mixing these two together is because, of course, JFK would be assassinated and LBJ would take over, and LBJ would be able to actually implement a lot of those things that JFK was not able to due to his presidency being shortened there. So, election of 1960, we're going to have John F. Kennedy, a Democrat, face off against Vice President Richard M. Nixon. This would not be Richard Nixon's first attempt at running for president. He had lost before as a candidate in other ways. Lyndon B. Johnson would be chosen as JFK's running mate. Lyndon B. Johnson was from Texas, and JFK was really hoping to get the Southern vote, knowing that he would need that to be able to win the election. So that's why LBJ would be picked. LBJ, somebody who had been a politician for most of his life. One of the historical things about this election is this is going to be the first time that you're going to have televised debates during that. There would be 4 debates that would be televised, and this would end up being a massive advantage for JFK. JFK, of course, an attractive guy, a younger guy, and he would just present himself a lot better on TV than Richard Nixon would. And actually, when people were watching and listening to the debates, most people have said when they were listening to the debate that they thought Nixon had won it. If they watched it on TV, they thought JFK had won it just because of the way that JFK presented himself on TV. We get to the election, and JFK would end up winning the election by about 120,000 votes. And you're going to see a lot of Republicans felt like the election had been stolen from them by the Democratic political machines in Illinois and Texas, who had helped swing the vote Kennedy's way. Now, there is a little bit of evidence that might have happened within Illinois there. The Chicago mayor, Richard Daley, that maybe he had something behind getting some votes pushed JFK's way, but there isn't any large-scale evidence of that happening. Again, election fraud is usually something that's very, very difficult to prove, and especially back then when we didn't have all the checks and guards that we have today. But either way, JFK wins the election. There's a video for you to watch that talks a little bit about JFK's strategies on TV and how it helped him to win the election. So in JFK's inaugural speech, there's 2 very famous parts of that. The pay any price part of it, which I've put on here, where basically he says, look, we will pay any price as a country to secure freedom and liberty around the world. And you can kind of say that's shots fired at the Soviet Union there. And then probably the most famous quote of his whole presidency would be, and so my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. And I think a lot of people would agree with that sentiment of, hey, let's look how we can better our country versus just taking from it always. JFK would be the youngest candidate ever to be elected president, so bringing a new, fresh face to the presidency, and you'll be able to hear his ask not speech or ask not line in that video there. So JFK coming in again as the youngest person to be in the presidency and from a new generation, he promised to lead the nation into a new frontier. Now, he would do that in a lot of ways. One of the ways that he would do it is looking at his administration a little bit different. He would take people who had expertise in the business world and had expertise outside of government and put them in cabinet positions. Probably the most famous of those is the business executive and Ford Motor Company President Robert McNamara. He would be named the Secretary of Defense, and you'll hear his name come back up as we talk about foreign policy and defense. Also, JFK would pick his own brother, Bobby Kennedy, to be Attorney General, which was controversial in some ways, but otherwise it made sense. Bobby Kennedy was known to be a very, very good lawyer during his time. Now, JFK, as far as his New Frontier programs, you'll see they're kind of similar to the New Deal. He would call for more aid to education, federal supportive health care, which again, that had been trying to be pushed since Truman was in office, urban renewal, and civil rights. And you'll see that very few of these would actually become law during his time as president, and many of them would be passed, though, under LBJ, his predecessor. So Domestically, what was going on here during JFK's presidency? You would have the creation of the Peace Corps in 1961. Peace Corps does a lot of work all around the world. Actually, I had a friend in college who, after student teaching, he joined the Peace Corps and went overseas to teach. You'd have the Alliance for Progress, again, to help out Latin America through a $20 billion program. Increased funding for NASA, which JFK is really going to be the one that pushes that we need to get to the moon. Commitment to fiscal policy. You'll see fiscally, in a lot of ways, he was a conservative with deficit spending and reducing income taxes. And then you would have a lot of big events happening during the civil rights movement during his time. And again, we're going to spend a whole day talking about the civil rights movement. But during this time, you'd have the Freedom Rider attacks, racial violence in Birmingham, which you can see the picture there, Bull Connor and his police crew there, the violence you'd have happen there, and you'd also have the March on Washington. And again, we're going to get into that another day because it's easier to kind of piece together the civil rights movement if you just talk about it all in one day. Now, the big defining thing of his presidency would be conflicts with Cuba as far as foreign policy goes. And the first one of those was a big strikeout, big failure, and that would be the Bay of Pigs. This is something that had been authorized under Eisenhower's administration, and JFK would come in and kind of just approve it happening. And what had happened is the CIA had been training these Cuban exiles that were here in Florida and in other places in Latin America, training them, giving them the military training that they needed. And then the goal was going to be to basically drop them off in Cuba, and they were to go in and take down Fidel Castro and the communist government there. And again, remember, we had talked about the CIA before having these plans to try to remove certain world leaders. Of course, Fidel Castro would be one of those. Now, this would line up with JFK and even Eisenhower's ideal of using strategic forces trained in guerrilla warfare versus using full-scale military type thing. JFK would do that. Eisenhower would do that as well. But as far as the Bay of Pigs would go, again, massive failure for a lot of different reasons. For one, Castro was tipped off ahead of time that this was going to be happening. Don't know how that happened, but it did. So he knew to look out for it. Another thing is that the invasion happened under a full moon, which full moon, it's easier to see outside. And so they could tell where these exiles were coming from. So the exiles would be captured. Kennedy would reject any ideas of using U.S. forces to save them because that could lead to a whole nother big problem there. Now, eventually the exiles would be returned to the United States. We'd be able to work out a deal to get them back here. But again, this represented a large-scale failure here in Cuba. Now, JFK, one of the things I really respect him for is after this happened, he actually did go on and gave a speech to the American people and talked about the failed invasion and basically said, like, he took the blame on himself and said, look, in the future, we are going to do better as far as like foreign policy and in regards to this kind of thing. Like, this isn't going to happen again. So I really like that for JFK because you don't typically see any presidents really take responsibility for things. And for him to do that, it says a lot about him as a person. 1961, you would have the Berlin Wall built. JFK had agreed to meet with Khrushchev in Vienna in 1961. Khrushchev would demand that the U.S. pull troops out of Berlin. Again, this is something they had tried several times. Of course, Kennedy refused. And so basically in response to that, Khrushchev orders the Berlin Wall be built because you did have during this time so many people from East Berlin going into West Berlin. And this was seen as a way to stop the flow of people going from the communist to the Democratic side. And you can see there the pictures of the building of it. And then eventually when JFK goes back there and actually gets to see the Berlin Wall. Of course, the Berlin Wall would stand until the late 1980s. It would be there kind of as a representative of that Iron Curtain that Churchill had talked about earlier. Next up, crisis that probably most closely, or was the time during the Cold War where we most closely came to actual war with the Soviet Union, would be the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. You'd have U.S. spy planes during this time would discover that the Soviets were building underground sites for missiles in Cuba that would be able to reach the United States in minutes. You can see here in this picture, this shows there Cuba, one of the missile sites, how you can see that within the range of that missile would be Washington, D.C. There's another one of these that actually shows that if it was a longer range missile, it can actually reach almost everywhere in the United States except for like Seattle, Washington. So this is going to be a big problem, and JFK is going to have to figure out how to best deal with this. So JFK, he first tries some back alleyways of communicating with the Soviets because before this conflict, the Soviets and the United States didn't have really any good way to communicate with each other. It was kind of like, we have differing views and we're not even going to really speak to each other in this. So JFK does that through the back channel methods that they use of communication. The Soviets deny having anything there. So then JFK would go on TV and would announce a naval blockade of Cuba until the weapons were gone. And he would actually call this a quarantine versus a blockade because under international law in international waters, you couldn't do a blockade like this. It would be considered active war. So JFK calls it a quarantine instead of that. And with this, again, now we're going on TV doing this. The American people know what's going on, and people start to get scared because people were worried now that if Soviet ships were to challenge that blockade or quarantine, as JFK called it, that could lead to full-scale nuclear war between each sides. You're going to see after a lot of going back, eventually a U.S. plane would actually be shot down flying over Cuba by the Cuban military there. After 13 days, there's actually a movie called 13 Days about this whole crisis. Khrushchev would agree to remove the missiles from Cuba as long as JFK pledged to not invade Cuba and to remove some older U.S. missiles from Turkey. Now, public relations-wise, the U.S., we weren't removing those missiles till much later. So on a PR standpoint, it looked like the United States won this conflict because we got the missiles removed from Cuba. And then much later on, people would find out about us removing missiles from Turkey, which actually were old missiles. So it wasn't a big of a deal for us to remove those from there. But yeah, this is the closest during the Cold War that you will see that we actually come to nuclear war. You can see here the results of the Cuban Missile Crisis. A telecommunications hotline was established between Moscow and Washington so that the leaders of the country could call it directly, because during this whole crisis, they weren't talking directly. They were going, again, through these back channel methods of communication. And then in 1963, you'd see the U.S. and the Soviet Union, along with 100 other nations, would sign the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty to end the testing of nuclear weapons in the atmosphere. So there were some good results to come out of this conflict. These political cartoons I put in here are ones that you quite often see of Kennedy and Khrushchev both trying to stop the dropping of hydrogen bombs in nuclear war with this crisis, because, again, that was the big concern, that we were heading for some sort of nuclear holocaust. Now, JFK also had the policy of flexible response. Him and McNamara would create this policy because you're going to see that over in Asia, Asia and Africa, that you were starting to have small conflicts breaking out in Congo, Laos, and Vietnam. These were often influenced by Soviet-provided arms and training, so the Soviets were going in and helping the communist side in this. So the flexible response was the idea of, hey, let's stop spending as much money on nuclear weapons and let's spend more money on conventional arms and mobile military forces. And the purpose of this, again, was to move away from this idea of nuclear war and the idea of that we could use small, specifically trained forces to have a greater impact than maybe nuclear war would have. Again, we're much more likely and willing to use traditional arms versus nuclear war. So this policy would reduce the risk of using nuclear weapons, but again, it would increase the temptation to send these elite special forces into combat all over the globe, which is exactly what would happen in several different places. But again, this was called the policy of flexible response, again, using the CIA and other groups to go into other places. So, for example, Vietnam, you'll see that Green Berets were prepared to enter the Vietnamese jungle as South Vietnam was on the verge of collapse to communism. Again, next class we'll be talking the whole time about Vietnam and everything associated with Vietnam. You can see during Kennedy's time in office here, 61 to 63. By his death, you have almost 17,000 Green Berets over there. Again, they aren't actually fighting, but they are there as support and training, kind of like what the Soviets were already doing around the world as well. That brings us to November of 1963. JFK had gone to visit Dallas, Texas, the first time in a long time a president had been to Dallas, Texas, and there he would be assassinated by Lee Harvey Oswald. Lee Harvey Oswald, if you look up and read about him, he had a very complicated past. He was a guy that had been in the U.S. military. He would actually disavow the U.S. military, went overseas, and go and live in the Soviet Union. He realized the Soviet Union wasn't as great as he thought it was to be. He would come back to the United States and be very angry and disheartened towards JFK, and they believe that is what led him to shoot and kill JFK. Lyndon B. Johnson would be sworn in on the plane on Air Force One back to Washington, D.C., which was carrying JFK's body. Again, JFK was hit in the head. He was shot twice. One of them was head. So, it was pretty apparent that he was going to die. And on the plane back to Washington, D.C., it was carrying JFK's body, and LBJ would take over. And again, our first president since William McKinley to be assassinated. Here, this is Walter Cronkite, very famous newsmaker of his time, and he would go on and announce the death of JFK, and you can really see the emotion in him if you want to check out that video of that. Now, Lee Harvey Oswald. Probably one of the things that really gets JFK's assassination going into the realm of the conspiracy theory is that Lee Harvey Oswald would be murdered. He would be arrested, and then he would be murdered by Jack Ruby, who was a Dallas nightclub owner who would walk up in this very famous picture live on TV, would walk up and shoot Lee Harvey Oswald in the stomach, which would kill him. And so because of that, we didn't get to really hear or know a lot about why Lee Harvey Oswald did what he did. Again, if you're one of the conspiracy theory people, they believe that Jack Ruby was hired to go kill Lee Harvey Oswald because maybe Lee Harvey Oswald knew secrets and maybe had been, told by the government to go kill JFK. Who knows? But yeah, he would be killed. So after his death, you would have the Warren Commission headed by Chief Justice Earl Warren. And this commission would conclude that Oswald was the lone assassin. Now, there would be a lot of unanswered questions in this report, and that's why you're going to see a ton of conspiracy theories come out about JFK's death. Some people saying, that he was assassinated by organized crime, that Fidel Castro had orchestrated it, that the CIA or the FBI was behind it. But because of this Warren report, and you're going to see all the doubts and the unanswered questions in it, a lot of people are going to doubt these government accounts. And you're going to see the government is going to start to lose credibility with the American people through this. And again, this is going to kind of start now, and it's going to be a long, slippery slope of this happening because of things that would happen in the 60s and the 70s. And if you talk to most people about JFK, a lot of people say that they think it's a conspiracy. We can't really know. I go based on just what the Warren Commission said because I'm a history teacher, and that's the fact that I have in front of me. So, yeah. All right. So who was LBJ? LBJ, again, I told you he was a native of Texas. He graduated from this little-known college, the Southwest Texas State Teachers College. He got involved in he was actually a teacher for a little bit. Got involved in politics, working on the staff of people, and then would, of course, go on to be elected as a U.S. Senator from Texas. Now, Johnson was known for his domineering personality and for giving people what they called the Johnson treatment, and that's what this picture is right there. He was known because of his height. He would basically go up and kind of intimidate people by towering and leaning over them. And that was known as the Johnson treatment there. And that was considered the way that he was able to actually get a lot done on Capitol Hill is by doing this kind of thing. Of course, you can see them in this picture kind of making fun of the Johnson treatment, but it was definitely something that he did do. So LBJ is president. His big focus, kind of like with JFK, would be expanding on the social reforms of the New Deal. So shortly after taking office, LBJ would persuade Congress to pass an expanded version of JFK's Civil Rights Bill. And he would also push and get Congress to pass JFK's proposal for an income tax cut. And this would actually be very good for the economy. This tax cut would spark an increase in jobs, consumer spending, and economic expansion. Now, the bigger thing of this is that it would be that Johnson would declare in 1964 an unconditional war on poverty. So you hear it's called Johnson's Great Society Programs and his war on poverty. And again, basically, he went back to that line of thinking of, hey, in the 50s, there's a lot of wealth for a lot of people, but we still have poverty in this country. And basically, what he wanted to eventually do is just eliminate poverty completely here in the United States. You're going to see the government would do a lot of different things and a lot of programs during this time. They would create the Office of Economic Opportunity, which would sponsor the Head Start program, which is a preschool program. the Job Corps for vocational education, literacy programs, and legal services. They would also create the Community Action Program, which will allow the poor to run these anti-poverty programs within their own neighborhood. And you're going to see, when you talk about the legacy of LBJ, it really comes down to two things: the war on poverty and the Vietnam War, which we will get into next class. So 1964, you have LBJ run for president. If you think about it, JFK had just been assassinated a year before that, and really LBJ would have to really screw up to lose this election because public sentiment was in his favor due to the assassination of LBJ. The Republicans would pick Barry Goldwater. And this is considered a turning point election because with this election, you're going to kind of see the start of the conservative movement or the conservative revolution that you're going to have here happen in the United States. Goldwater was very, very conservative. He was anti-communist, anti-big government, and pledged that he was offering a choice, not an echo. And although he loses, and as you can see there, he lost pretty big, he is credited with beginning the start of the conservative revolt that would really change American politics. And with this, you're going to have some characters that come out and grow in popularity, such as the actor Ronald Reagan. He's going to come out in support of Goldwater, and you're going to see a lot of the things and the ideals that Goldwater had. Again, at this point, not really sticking with the American people, but they eventually would grow in popularity with the American people. Now, LBJ would use this really big victory that he would have, and he would also have a filibuster-proof majority in the Senate to start enacting his Great Society and War on Poverty programs. Now, we're talking about this. I'll show you here. There's a campaign ad from Barry Goldwater talking about big government. And then probably the most famous political ad still in U.S. history is what is the Daisy ad. This ad was actually only shown once because it was so controversial. And like I said, it's still considered one of the most controversial political ads ever made. I'm not going to ruin it for you, but check out the Daisy campaign ad here. Usually people get quite the chuckle out of that when they watch that. Again, I said the election of 1964. A big change. Ronald Reagan, he would give his famous "A Time for Choosing" speech at the 1964 Republican presidential convention. And he would give this speech in support of Barry Goldwater. And this is what would launch Reagan, who is an actor, into national prominence within political circles. He would soon be asked to run for governor of California, and he would win that governorship. And again, just to show you how impactful this speech is, that some historians have described it as the most impactful political speech since William Jennings Bryan's Cross of Gold speech in 1896. I did linked to a video there that you can watch, and the video actually just talks a little bit about the speech. You'll be able to hear a little bit about it, but it's journalists talking about just the impact that this speech would have. But back to LBJ. So, like I said, with the Democrats having control of Congress, LBJ would have freedom to pass his economic and social agenda, which he would do. I put a bunch of examples of programs on there. Food stamps, Medicare, Medicaid, Child Nutrition Act. A lot of different programs are going to be passed under these Great Society reforms. Congress would also increased funding for mass transit, public housing, rent subsidies, and there would be two new cabinet-level positions created: the Department of Transportation and the Department of Housing and Urban Development, which is commonly called the HUD department. And you're going to see these are things that are still around today. A lot of these are programs that are still around today in some iteration during this time. And again, his big goal was to eliminate poverty and to, make our society great again, you could say. Other reforms that you're going to see during this time. Ralph Nader, 1965, would write the book Unsafe at Any Speed. Unsafe at Any Speed was basically about how the auto industry was not doing everything for safety that they could, and how the auto industry actually prevented vehicles from becoming safer. So you're going to see that with this, Congress would pass regulations on the automobile industry. And again, we'll talk more about that at a later date. You'll also see Rachel Carson would write the book Silent Spring in 1962, which would be talk about the dangers of pesticides, and that would eventually lead to Clean Air and Water Acts, which we'll talk more about later as well. Now, as the big initiative under Lady Bird Johnson, LBJ's wife, she helped to push for more protection on federal parks and wilderness areas. And she started the Beautify America campaign, which resulted in the Highway Beautification Act, which basically was a way of cleaning up all the billboards and stuff that you had along interstates, and basically just trying to make the roads look prettier in the whole country. So again, you typically see first ladies, especially modern first ladies, they have these like little pet projects that they do, and that was hers. Now, when you're looking at the Great Society, it's hard to look at it without really evaluating it. And really, when you evaluate the Great Society and the war on poverty, you're going to see that your political perspectives is going to influence how you evaluate that, whether or not it worked, or whether it did not. Critics will point to the Great Society programs and say, hey, they are unrealistic. Eliminating poverty completely is impossible. They would also say that it would create a centralized welfare state, which it would, leading to more single-parent homes, which in a lot of ways that it did if you look at the historical trends, and for being insufficient and costly. People also point out, critics say, look, we had a really strong economy during this time, and that actually had more of an effect on reducing poverty versus the Great Society programs. Now, supporters of these programs say, hey, these programs gave assistance to Americans that had previously been forgotten and really needed these programs because they had been ignored in that. Like I said, when you're evaluating the Great Society, it largely depends on your political perspective. And a lot of times for people, it's like, do you think that government programs like this work to actually help people, or does it create a culture of reliance on the government, that kind of thing? So when you're evaluating it, again, it depends on which side of the, political spectrum that you are on. Now, we're talking about the Great Society. A lot of times you're going to see people compare the Great Society, especially like on AP exams, to the New Deal. So make sure that you have a good understanding of both of these programs and what exactly the end results were for them. Now, his lasting legacy would be the Vietnam War, which we'll discuss next class. And really, you're going to see his presidency kind of comes off the rails as far as the war on poverty goes, because he starts to spend most of his focus of the presidency on the Great Society programs and what exactly they were doing. Because of the Vietnam War, and because of how unpopular the Vietnam War would grow, LBJ would announce in March of 1968 that he would not run again for election in the 1968 election. And again, that's because Vietnam was very, very unpopular. So that brings us to the end of LBJ's presidency. Again, next class, we are going to jump into the Vietnam War. And we're actually going to be talking about 3 presidents next time: LBJ, Nixon, and Gerald Ford. So we're going to have a lot packed into next class, as well as the Vietnam War. So I hope you have a fantastic day.